guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Be Brave podcast with me, your host, Grace. Today, I will be joined by the lovely Nadia Maxwell, non-diet dietitian, intuitive eating counsellor, clinical hypnotherapist, and founder of Oh Well Co. Together, we will chat about orthorexia, as well as how to shift your mindset around calories. So, without further ado, here is Nadia. Hi Nadia, thank you so much for joining me today for an episode. I'm so excited to have you on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Grace. I'm excited as well.
Before we get into today's topics, I would really love if you could tell us all a bit about yourself. So if you have any pets or hobbies or favourite music.
Yeah, sure. So as hopefully people know, I'm a dietitian, but in terms of myself, I am actually Kiwi. So I grew up in New Zealand. I did my undergrad degree at Otago University and then moved to Melbourne for my master's in dietetics. So that was way back in 2015, I think I started my master's, and then met my partner who's an Aussie, so ended up with this weird Australian Kiwi accent. But in terms of my hobbies, gosh, I think I must have just got so obsessed with work over the past 7-8 years that hobbies kind of fell by the wayside, and I'm still so passionate about my work, but I've been trying to rebuild things outside of work. So definitely my cats I adore, and then also my partner and I have a van. So on weekends, it's got a little bed in the back. So on weekends we try and get away, go to the beach or the bush. So that's something that I love doing as well.
That sounds lovely. I wish that's always been a dream of mine, to have a van and just be able to go out and camp, and sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's so good. It gives you so much freedom, which is, really nice. Particularly, where we live in Victoria, there's so many beautiful beaches and walks to see. So, I'm obsessed.
Oh, lovely. So at the beginning of the episode, I mentioned that you work as a non-diet dietitian, intuitive eating counsellor, and clinical hypnotherapist. But I was wondering if you'd be able to explain what that looks like on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, of course. So I work full-time for myself now. That hasn't always been the case. So as a younger dietitian, often it was mostly client-facing. So in the past, it would be, I did a stint in working in hospitals and community health. But since I now work for myself, I'm the everything girl, right? So most of my time is spent seeing clients, and that's usually one-on-one. And the spiel that I give to clients in terms of what I actually do is that I work with a lot of people with challenging symptoms. So lots of, gut symptoms, pelvic pain, endometriosis, hormonal stuff going on. But I also work with a lot of people with a challenging relationship with food and their body. So I definitely don't take a eat this, don't eat this approach. It's more so, how can I support you to improve your symptoms or reach your health goals whilst also having a happy relationship with food? So that's essentially what I spend most of my time doing, seeing one-on-one clients. And then I'm a bit of a sensitive soul, so I can't see too many people in a week. I try and cram as many as I can handle, but outside of that, I really love doing my own professional development. So I'm obsessed with doing lots of training, as you can probably tell from all the things beside my name, the clinical hypnotherapy, the intuitive eating counsellor. I love doing lots of trainings. And then I'm also a little bit obsessed with, creating fact sheets and resources for clients, and just doing kind of research on the side, as well as, of course, having a crack at social media and marketing and all the other stuff that comes in with business, which, I definitely wasn't trained to do. So it's a bit up and down, but that's pretty much how I spend my weeks.
That sounds like a really nice mix of things. You get the client side, but then also your own sort of private work that you get to do. Sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I love it.
So obviously today we're going to talk a little bit about orthorexia. And whilst it's spoken about more and more people are aware of it, I think it's important to define it just for people who might not know exactly what it is. So according to proposed diagnostic criteria, it's defined as an obsessive focus on healthy eating as defined by a dietary theory or a set of beliefs whose specific details may vary. It's marked by an exaggerated emotional distress in relation to food. I was wondering if there's anything you would add to that definition.
Yeah, and I think probably the simplest way people might describe orthorexia is an unhealthy obsession with healthy eating is generally kind of the simple way of putting it. So it's where we become so focused on eating healthy or improving our health that it kind of crosses that line into becoming or detracting from our well-being. Now, I think with any eating disorders or disordered eating, there's a lot more below the surface, isn't there, than just that. So I always like to kind of dig a little bit deeper anytime we're kind of defining what that might look like. So, and it's funny, you mentioned that those criteria are proposed, so they're not actually in the DSM, but one type of eating disorder where I think there's actually a bit of overlap with orthorexia that is in the DSM is ARFID, so avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So for those people that don't know what ARFID is, it's a type of eating disorder which involves, the avoidance or the restriction of food to the point that it significantly impacts our physical, psychological, or social health. And unlike the more, well-known eating disorders, it has nothing to do with our body shape, weight, or size, or at least it's not, the primary thing that's driving that. And so that can really appear differently for different people. So a lot of my clients with ARFID might have, sensory sensitivity. So a lot of my kind of neurodivergent clients might fall into that category. It can also be just a lack of interest in food. But I think the root which has most of the overlap with orthorexia is what we call fear of adverse consequences. And so in kind of that orthorexia space, it is that fear of adverse consequences to health that I see most commonly. So there's that physical health, but then I also often see the social health aspect as well when it comes to orthorexia. And I'd just like to break each of those down because I think it's really complex. I think if we take that really simple definition, we don't really get the depth as to what might be going on for the person. And of course, it's individual. But when it comes to physical health, it can just be kind of this nondescript desire for better, quote unquote, health or maybe longevity, right? But for some people, it might even be that they have experienced a period of poor health or maybe might still even be in one. So an example of some of my clients might be that they had glandular fever as a teenager, or maybe they had COVID-19 or long COVID, and this obsession with healthy eating has kind of developed almost from a fear of not wanting to end up like that again. Or it can almost be vicarious for some people. So, for example, if someone's had an experience where a loved one might have gone through a cancer diagnosis or cardiovascular disease, then it's more so through watching that where they might then be like, I can't let that happen to me or to my loved ones. And then this obsession with healthy eating comes as a result of that. So there's a lot more complexity when we think about so-called health. But then there's this kind of other group, which I think they can absolutely overlap. But I guess when I would think back of my experience with orthorexia, I probably fell more into this latter group where it's more of a subconscious driver, and it's more of that subconscious driver which is related to social health and well-being. Because if we think about our idea of quote unquote health in society, it's almost like we treat it as a bit of a moral obligation. Like if you don't have health, then you are less worthy or quote unquote lazy. And I mean, it makes it so difficult because I think our assumption about health as a society or how we view it is often very unrealistic, right? Like it's often baked with anti-fat bias and misogyny and, racism and ableism, right? All the isms. So we have this very narrow window of what we expect health to look like. And if we believe, or if society gives us the message that if we meet that standard of health, we will have more acceptance, more belonging, more validation, more self-worth, then it makes a lot of sense to me why someone might strive for that health or well-being through food, because, they're being sold that that's what they'll get in return. And so I think that's often a lot more subconscious. I can see that from myself after years of being out of orthorexia and with a lot of hindsight, right? But I think it's really helpful to kind of understand the complexity of orthorexia and how that might be related to physical health, social health, or both of them.
I love how you've separated into those two different areas that may or may not overlap. It's a really interesting way to look at it. And you've touched on it a bit already about how it's so culturally accepted, this healthy eating, and that's what's going to mean that you're more worthy and more accepted. And so because orthorexia is so easily disguised as clean eating and striving for health, how do you think it's possible to distinguish just a general strive for health from something that's gone a bit too far into orthorexia?
Yeah, and I think it is really important to distinguish, because I think in today's day and age as well, people can be made to feel bad for wanting to improve their health, which a lot of my clients do. And I'm like, I get it, particularly if they have such difficult symptoms. But I think there's this kind of, it's almost like this line in the sand, which is different to every person. And where I often see that line is kind of crossed is where it starts to impact on our quality of life. And like I said, it's different for every person, but that might impact either our physical, our psychological, or our social quality of life. So an example of physical might be where we cross that line in the sand where without eating starts to have negative health consequences. So it might be things like losing our hair or having low energy or, impacting gut function, impacting sleep, all those things. And then if we think more about social, then it might be crossing that line whereby we start to, avoid eating out in social situations because we don't know what's going to be on the menu. Or maybe we don't let other people cook for us because we're so afraid of eating foods that are outside what we deem appropriate. Or the psychological health aspect, of course, as well, is whereby it might take up a whole lot of our brain space and actually take up so much that it's detracting from other things in life. So I think that line in the sand is really individual for everyone, but I guess it's where it detracts from our quality of life in whether that's psychological, social, or physical realm.
I think that can be a really helpful tool for anyone questioning if they're struggling, just to be able to think, instead of looking at, diagnostic criteria and, does that apply to me? Looking at it from a more individualistic approach and thinking, is it affecting one of these 3 different areas or multiple?
Yeah, often multiple.
I think it's unlikely to just have one impacted.
Yeah.
They're the sort of things that detract from our whole life.
Mm.
And so another aspect that I think links in with eating disorders and orthorexia is the use of social media. Because it's being used so much more and there's so much comparison going on, as well as, individuals that aren't actually qualified spreading misinformation and fear-mongering, it's leading to a lot of worsened symptoms, worsened comparison, worsened fear. I was wondering how you think it's impacting people struggling with orthorexia specifically.
Yeah, I guess there's so many levels in which it can impact someone, and I think this is where that kind of sense of belonging or social health that I talked about before really shines through, because often, on social media we are sold this idea that if we reach this certain level of health, if we look a certain way, if we eat a certain way, if we, make sure everything in our household is non-toxic or, X, Y, Z, then it's almost like we will have, once again, the sense of belonging or acceptance. And I'm not even denying that that's sometimes not the case, right? Sometimes when we do start to change our eating or our lifestyle in a certain way, we do build more community, right? Like, it might be that keto community or that low carb community or that whole foods community for at least a short term. And I think it is really hard because I totally understand it, because in today's day and age, even though we are so connected through social media, I think people have also never been more lonely. So it's not necessarily those deep connections, because it's safe to say that social media is a highlight reel. You can't see someone's life in a picture or in a reel, but it sells us that if we eat that way or act that way or change our lifestyle in that way, we might get more of that sense of belonging and community. And so when it comes to social media, and if we find ourselves comparing, I think a really good question to ask is what am I searching for here? And does it come more into that latter category of that sense of belonging?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting paradox that you've highlighted, how we're so much more connected than we've ever been. So many ways to get in touch with people across the world and meet people that you never would have met before. Yet at the same time, we're extremely isolated because we're all left in these bubbles comparing ourselves to everyone else and feeling so alone in that.
Yeah, and it, like I said, like sometimes communities that do eat a certain way, it is a way for connection for people that maybe they might not have in their kind of real non-online life. So I 100% get why people do it. I guess what I see and what I know for myself, it's only ever, it doesn't actually give you that sense of deep, embodied, long-term self-worth that we're actually looking for.
Yeah. Another aspect that I wanted to touch on was, for many people with eating disorders, calories play a huge part in disordered thoughts. And an increasingly common belief, due to social media and fear-mongering and all of that, is that the fewer calories something has, the healthier it must be. What would you tell someone who was struggling with this thought or who really believed this thought?
Yeah, I love to help flip the script on calories. I think they get such a bad rap in our society, and they don't need to. Like, I think just changing our relationship with them can be so helpful. And I think to be able to do that, it actually helps to understand a little bit of the science behind it, because I'm a bit of a science nerd. But first we kind of have to understand metabolism, and then it helps to understand calories. So if we think about metabolism, our metabolism is essentially all the energy our body needs to live. So, and it breaks it down into roughly 3 areas. So 10% of our metabolic needs are made up of what we call the thermic effect of food. So that's essentially the energy we use to digest and metabolize our food. About 15 to 30% is made up by physical movement, and that's not just exercise, it's also things like brushing our teeth, blinking, getting up out of bed, getting dressed, all kind of movement. And then the last, which is 60 to 70%, is actually made up of our resting metabolic rate. So if we were to sit still, not move a single muscle, we would still be using 60 to 70% of our daily energy needs. And how I often like to demonstrate that for people, because often people are like, really? I thought exercise or movement and resting metabolic rate would be swapped. But we actually use so much at rest. And I often get people to kind of hold their hand up in a fist in front of them and actually pump it a bit like a heart. And then you just do that for a little bit and you're just like, oh my gosh, that does take a lot of energy. And when we think about it, yes, our heart is using a lot of energy. It's pumping 24/7, but then we've got our lungs, and then we've got, our pancreas making enzymes, and then we've got our brain, which uses so much energy. So I think it's really helpful to understand kind of that proportion that actually a lot of our energy needs, and therefore calories, goes to just our body functioning at rest. And then the other thing to understand is how our metabolism is actually quite flexible in those needs. So it can increase its needs, and it can decrease its needs. And that's exactly why calories in, calories out doesn't actually work, because of that flexibility. And flexibility is a really healthy thing. So if there's not, if as humans, we evolved in times of famine. So we evolved when there wasn't actually enough food necessarily available. And so our bodies have developed those complex mechanisms, that flexibility, to essentially keep us alive. So if our brain recognizes, okay, there's not enough food coming in, and it does not know the difference between, intentional restriction or dieting and a famine. So it'll just go, okay, this isn't good. The alarm bells go off. I'd better down-regulate my metabolism, so I'm burning less fuel, so I'm preserving that energy for the things that keep me alive, right? My heart, my lungs, my brain to an extent. And that down-regulation in metabolism is a really positive thing for our survival. And that's exactly why so many people will say, the first diet was so easy. It worked really well. I could stick for it the longest. I lost the most weight. But at a point, that weight loss is going to plateau because your body is doing its best to keep you safe. And that's through that metabolic flexibility, which is actually a really healthy thing. And so when we understand that our body's metabolism is really flexible, that helps us to understand how actually increasing calories then supports a more robust metabolism. It's this kind of, I really like to use this log fire analogy. So if we think of the logs as the food or calories, energy, and we think of the fire as our metabolism, if we're putting small twigs on a fire every, 6 hours, it's never actually going to burn as bright as a fire that we're putting nice juicy logs on every 3 to 4 hours, right? And that's exactly kind of how our metabolism works. When we're really nourishing it and fueling it, it doesn't have to go into energy saving mode to protect our livelihood and our well-being. So that's why calories in, calories out doesn't actually work. And then when we actually think about calories themselves, yes, they're that measure of energy. So they're actually a measure of heat energy. And so it's funny because I have so many clients, pretty much every client is like, I want more energy. I need more energy. It's like, well, actually, we're not plants. We can't photosynthesize. We get energy from food. And so when we can flip to look at calories as kind of that life-giving energy, then we can see that they're actually the things that we use to laugh, to play, to socialize, to work, to essentially live a fulfilling life. And calories are amazing, and I think they're great. And I also think they're just one part of food. So when we think about food, it's useful to kind of zoom out. We think about how our macronutrients, carbs, proteins, fats, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and how they all serve a purpose, a beautiful purpose in our life and our well-being. And then if we zoom out one more time, then we can actually see how food is absolutely fuel and can nourish us, but it's also fuel for our social well-being, connection, nostalgia, tradition, all those other beautiful things. So that's essentially my view on calories, and I hopefully someone finds it helpful, because I just think they're so misunderstood and given way too much attention as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an amazing definition and such a good description that you've given that's easy to, I'm obviously not a dietitian, so even without having gone to school for that, you made it very easy to understand. One of my favorite things that you just said was that, a calorie is like for a laugh, and thinking about it in that way, in like, as we take money and exchange it for food, we take in calories, and it comes out as, going for a walk with my friend, or being able to read a book and concentrate on it.
Yeah, it's essentially all an exchange of energy. I love that idea.
I think that's a really beautiful way to think about it, instead of I take this in and then I have to burn it off. It's not that way. It's just an exchange that our body already knows how to work through. When you work with individuals with orthorexia, what have you found to be the sort of top most helpful strategies and tips when overcoming disordered thoughts and behaviours? Which is obviously quite a broad question and will be quite individualistic. But if you had some broad ones.
Yeah, you're so right. It is absolutely individual. But I guess if I were to think of kind of broad recommendations, I mean, first and foremost, I think the most important thing is getting support. So I 100% acknowledge that, eating disorder treatment you need a lot of privilege to access that. So if you can have a treatment team, that is beautiful and wonderful and can be so supportive. And I don't think it has to be limited to that. I think even if we just have a friend or a loved one we can open up to, I always say shadows always thrive in the dark. So when we bring how we're feeling and our thoughts into the light, hopefully with the support of other, then that is so helpful. It can also be a podcast like your podcast, or your social media accounts in the positive sense, or some kind of community, even a spiritual community, whatever it might be. But I definitely think support is probably number one on the list. And then as well as that, I think, stepping through fear is a really important part of the process of healing. I think what can happen with any eating disorder, including orthorexia, is that our comfort zones can shrink and shrink and shrink. So we become more and more fearful of certain foods or frequencies of eating or amounts of food. And it's almost like it can become so small that our world becomes so small. And then anytime we're challenged, it's often not by choice. Like, we run into challenges because our comfort zone is so small, and it can be so scary when that's not our choice. And it can almost reinforce that I can't do this. I am stuck. I can't, I get so much anxiety when this happens. So I really think such an important piece is actually making it our choice to step through that fear and almost prove to ourselves that I can change and I can evolve and I'm not stuck through my own choice. And just slowly start to increase that comfort zone. And yes, it can absolutely be around food. It can be, choosing the soy milk instead of the almond milk because it's got slightly more calories. Or it can be, maybe we're comfortable with one piece of bread but not two, so we can do 1.5, right? It's those tiny little steps. But it can also be, if even that's too scary, it can be doing something totally outside of the realm of food. So it can be, opening up to that loved one, or maybe setting a boundary with someone you need to, or asking for that promotion at work, right? It's kind of proving to ourselves that we can step through fear and we can grow, and just little by little taking those steps. And lastly, it's that also that subconscious inner work. I think stepping through fear is so much easier when we help ourselves to get to that root of that problem and do that subconscious inner work that's driving the challenges to begin with. And once again, that can be so much easier with a kind of mental health professional. But once again, it can be a loved one or a spiritual community or whoever that might be for you to be able to do that, inner work.
I really love how all of the things that you've mentioned come from a place of self-empowerment, and they're all self-led, and they're all coming from a place of, I want to do this. I am going to challenge myself and prove to myself that I can, and I'm doing it for me.
Yeah. That's how I like to work.
Yeah. I think that's much better than some approaches that you often see, which are quite punitive and act as if someone's doing something wrong and they have to be told what to do or punished for doing something.
Yeah, and it can be so hard. It really can, because not everyone is in that space that they're ready or wanting to change. And that's so hard, especially if our brain is undernourished. It makes it really, really difficult to kind of see that bigger picture and see the light and see where we want to move through. But people do have to come to their own conclusion and their own decision to grow as a person. And I guess it's like, once we have that, then all autonomy to the person to be able to make those changes, and kind of hopefully they also have someone that can, be that cheerleader for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And so once someone has, decided that they're ready to start working on things, what I found is that for lots of people struggling with eating disorders, just small affirmations can be really helpful. Just so when you're going throughout your day, or when you're facing a challenge, just little affirmations like, my body is only a vessel, or I can make it through this. Do you have any affirmations that you find really useful?
Yeah, so when you sent me this question, I did write down a couple because I agree. I think affirmations can be lovely. I think they need to be paired with that subconscious inner work, as well as I always like to not acknowledge that it's not just an individual problem, right? It is a societal problem, so society 100% needs to change. But I do think affirmations can be lovely, and one of my favorite people on the topic of kind of bodies and body liberation is Sonia Renee Taylor. So you're nodding. She's wonderful. She's so good. So I think she's moved a little bit out of this space in terms of what she does now. But her book is called The Body Is Not an Apology. And I have a few of her kind of affirmation ebooks. So I pulled a couple from that to share. So the first one is, as I heal my heart, I trust my body to follow. As I heal my heart, I trust my body to follow. So I really like that one.
That one's beautiful.
And then, yeah, it's nice, isn't it? And then there's another one I wanted to share. It's a bit longer, but I'll try and summarize it at the end. But the second one I really like from her is, we do not ask the ocean to shrink or play small. We never ask the stars to shine less brightly or be less awe-strikingly gorgeous. I am made of the exact same materials as each. Why should I do or be any less? Today I will step unapologetically into my vast magnificence. Wow. And so how I would summarize that one would be something like, we never ask the stars to shine less brightly. Why should I do or be any less? So I really like that one too.
That's really beautiful and so suitable for people struggling with eating disorders, because often it is an illness that focuses so much on shrinking yourself and being less and taking up less space.
Yeah, 100%. And so you can come up with your own, affirmation about any of that. It can be, I am a giant, I am magnificent, I am magic, whatever resonates for you. But then one other one that I wrote myself, which really ties into the kind of modality of self-compassion, which I think is just such a lovely adjunct to this work, is because I guess self-compassion is essentially acknowledges that as humans we will come across suffering, we will have hard times, and that's actually part of life. And so one that I wrote, which kind of encapsulates the essence of self-compassion, is, even in the hard times, I'm here for myself. Yeah.
Really beautiful. I think
so those would be my top three.
I love those top three, and I love that you brought up Sonia Renee Taylor as well. So for anyone who hasn't read her book, I found it a really just inspiring book and so informative as well. She brings up so much about all the isms you were talking about before, and she's really not afraid to say what a lot of people skirt around. So
100%.
I imagine you would recommend it as well.
Yeah, I do. And she's even got a workbook as well that goes alongside it. I don't think I have the workbook, but I have her original book. And I actually think I was on her website a few minutes ago, and I think she's got a second edition of The Body Is Not an Apology coming out. So,
Very exciting. Well, for anyone listening, have a look, see if they can find that second edition and have a read. It's been so interesting talking to you today. Thank you so much for joining me. Before you go, I always ask the same question at the end of any episode, and that is, if listeners only took away one thing from today's episode, what would you want them to remember?
It's a good question. I'll try and be succinct. One thing.
I know, it's a tricky question.
Yeah. I have so many.
So many amazing points from today.
But I guess to kind of encapsulate what we've talked about, I guess the main thing is that, there is nothing wrong with you or your body, no matter what society says. You do not need to be fixed. You are whole as you are. And the one certainty about life is that we will always be with ourselves and with our body till our dying day, right? And so my hope for everyone is that they can become their own biggest cheerleader, right? Their own biggest support system. And also that's okay if that takes time.
That's such a lovely note to end on, and I hope that everyone takes that to heart and carries it with them throughout their week. Thank you
Lovely.
again for talking with me today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Grace, for having me.
That was such a beautiful note that Nadia left us with. I'm so glad that she could join us to share so many amazing insights. Please don't forget that you are strong, you are enough, and like Nadia said, you are worthy of being your own cheerleader and knowing that you are inherently whole and enough. Until next time, keep being brave.